Hey everyone, today we're looking at chapter 49, The Maple Leaf Rag by Scott Joplin. Looking back at our music history timeline, we are considering 20th century music at this point, although today's piece technically was published in 1899, but we'll lump it in with 20th century because of its influence thereafter through the beginning of the 20th century. I want to give you a little bit of background on the composer and this piece, and then I'll ask you to listen to it on your own. It's a short piano piece, about 3 minutes long, so it won't take you too much time. But this piece is by the composer Scott Joplin, who lived from 1868 to 1917. So he died quite young in his 40s, unfortunately, but did quite a bit of important things during that short lifetime. He was an African-American composer and pianist, born in Arkansas, then shortly after moved to Texas. He was a railroad builder for a while playing piano and composing on the side. Eventually went to college and was able to have his music published, which was quite a feat for an African-American musician in the late 19th century. So he was known as the King of Ragtime eventually. It's a name he gave himself, but many others continued to call him that, and I think that's definitely fitting for him. And so he wrote over the course of his life 44 ragtime pieces, 2 ballets, and 1 opera. So we'll be defining and analyzing ragtime as a genre, but it is certainly a uniquely American contribution to music, and it's a very different style and genre, whereas ballet and opera are European genres that have been around for centuries at this point in time. So he kind of dabbled in both areas, but he always gave this sort of ragtime spin to even genres like the ballet and opera. So the piece we're analyzing for chapter 49 is called The Maple Leaf Rag. Over here on the right, you can see the cover page of the original publication here. And this was Scott Joplin's most famous work, and you very well may be familiar with it already because it's used all the time in media and television and films, quite popular. He wrote many other very successful pieces as well, but this is the one that sold the most and really sort of put his name on the map. Amazingly, it was the first piece of instrumental music to ever sell over 1 million copies, which is today still quite a feat, but again, for an African-American man, in the late 19th, early 20th century, really quite a tremendous feat. So he definitely changed the course of American music with his ragtime style. So I'm going to ask you to maybe pause this video and listen to the piece if you haven't already done so, Maple Leaf Rag, chapter 49. And I want you to pay attention to 3 specific elements of music here: the rhythm, the melody, and the form. So as you're listening, most especially pay attention to melody. Try to find the beat. Is there a regular, consistent beat? We've seen so far genres of music that don't have that. For example, Schoenberg's Pierrot Lunaire, or Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. It's hard as a listener to kind of tap your foot along and find a regular, consistent beat. So see if that's the case here or not. Listen for rhythmic accents, and also try to consider why this genre would be called ragtime. It's quite an unusual word. Also pay attention to melody. Can you identify particular melodies? And sort of how do they return back and forth throughout the piece, if they do so at all. And again, we've looked at pieces of music that don't really have very discernible melodies, so see if that's the case here. And also pay attention to form, and this relates to melody. Do you hear different sections throughout the piece? Do you hear returning melodic material at any point? Do you get a sense of a kind of a cohesive whole? So again, please pause this, listen to that with these things in mind, and then return here and we will continue on in our analysis. All right, so let's define the phrase ragtime, or the genre of ragtime. I asked you previously, why do we, right here, why do you think this genre is called ragtime? And this has to do with the rhythm. So ragtime is a genre of very highly syncopated piano music. It's most well known as being for solo piano. And so syncopation means to, I'm going to change the slide here. Syncopation means to emphasize or accent the weak or the off beat, as opposed to a straight beat, which emphasizes the on beat or the strong beat. So I'll play you some examples of that. So this is what the word ragged mean. That's where it comes from, because a syncopated, kind of uneven rhythm tends to sound a little bit ragged. It's called ragging the beat. So this is a ragtime piece. So importantly, since we're looking at a piece for solo piano, we've got two hands of the pianist, and they're each kind of doing different jobs. So the left hand is the hand that's playing the lower notes on the piano, so they're playing sort of the bass line, and the left hand is going to be playing a straight beat, and it's very march-like. So I'll play you an example of what a march from this time period would have sounded like. Whereas the right hand is doing the very quick, fast-moving, highly decorated, syncopated melody. So one hand's keeping a straight beat, and the right hand is using that straight beat in the bass line to syncopate off of, using that sort of as a foundation. You may have also noticed that this sounds a little bit jazz-like, and this very much is kind of what's considered to be the precursor to what we know as jazz. And in fact, Scott Joplin died in the year 1917, and that also happens to be the year that the first jazz album was ever recorded, professionally recorded. So he really kind of handed over the baton, so to speak. So I mentioned I want to show you examples of both a straight beat and also a syncopated beat. So I want to show you a quick clip of John Philip Sousa's Stars and Stripes Forever, which is a march. Think of it for a marching band. I'm guessing, probably familiar with this already, but I'll play you a short excerpt of this so that you get the sense. I'm just going to turn down the volume a little bit here. Of what a march sounds like. So you're thinking actually marching with your feet 1, 2, 1, 2 on the beat, a straight beat. So this is the type of music that was very popular among a lot of Americans, especially white Americans during this time period. So just to get that in your head. All right, so you've probably heard that before, and you can kind of almost imagine yourself marching along to that. So think of that as being sort of the left hand's job here. So again, returning to the idea of syncopation, this is the right hand's job. So to syncopate a beat is to emphasize the weak beat, and I have right here some musical notation that's commonly used in ragtime. So the notes here on the bottom, those are what would be the straight beat. That's the consistent straight beat on the main beat. And then the top notes are the syncopated off beats. So I'm going to turn on my metronome right here, which is like a machine that keeps a steady beat going. And you can consider this to be the underlying straight beat. So 1, 2, 1, 2, and over top of that we can syncopate it. Okay, so that automatically makes it a little bit more exciting, and my hand claps were emphasizing the space in between each of those metronome beats. So here are the first 4 bars of Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag. Of course, I don't expect you to be able to read musical notation, but we're always looking for patterns in notation, and those are easy to pick out. So here I've noted that we're in 2/4, that's the meter, meaning it's a duple meter, so 2 beats per measure, 1, 2, 1, 2. And so these main on beats are labeled right here, 1, 2, 1, 2. That's our straight beat in the bass line. And the bass line here is doubling that twice as fast, 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's still keeping a straight beat. Whereas the right hand here on the top is playing this syncopated melody. And so the accented beats, the emphasized beats here, as you can see labeled in blue, don't line up with the beats that are marked in red. They're kind of displaced from one another. So that shows us kind of in a visual sense this type of syncopation that we can expect. So I'm going to turn on the metronome once again, and you can kind of envision this metronome as playing the roll down here of this straight beat in the bass line. And I'm going to once again clap. I'm going to clap these first four measures here, accenting the weak beats. Okay, so the right hand, or my claps in that case, are playing a much more kind of complicated rhythmic pattern over top of that straight beat. So this concept of syncopation hasn't really been emphasized that much in classical music up until this point. It's very percussive, it's very rhythmic. And so where does this come from? And keep in mind, as I mentioned, Scott Joplin was African American, so he comes with a background and a culture of many different sort of musical traditions than many of the white classical European trained composers would have. Two of those things would be African influences, including the drum and the banjo, and I think we can hear both of those here. So I have included this video in our music appreciation playlist before as an example of rhythm, but this is an example of West African drumming, a cultural music tradition that emphasizes rhythm and syncopation above melody. So you can have a rhythmic piece without melody. So I'll play you a short clip of this. All right, so pause it there. So you can hear many different interlocking rhythmic patterns that form this highly syncopated, highly complicated rhythmic pattern. So that's a style of African music that would have been brought over during the slave trade. And another example, let's see if I can find it here, of, sorry, I'm looking for the video. Another example of a musical tradition that comes from Africa and is brought over to North America during the slave trade is that of banjo playing. And I think a lot of people today think of banjo as being like an American instrument used for like bluegrass or kind of associated with like hillbilly music. But in fact, the banjo was originally an African instrument. The body of the banjo in coming from Africa was usually made out of some sort of gourd rather than the metal body that we see today. But it was actually brought over by Africans during the slave trade and then eventually co-opted by white musicians. And so I think we can hear a little bit of this influence. If you think about the banjo, it's very quick moving based on the placement of the strings. It tends to move really fast and be kind of really complicated in terms of the plucking. So this is a kind of a cool recording here. We've got a banjo player playing Maple Leaf Rag, and I think you'll hear that it works really well, and in many ways the piano also actually seems to be imitating the sound of a banjo. Okay, so pretty neat right there. So those are two examples of African influences that were brought over during the slave trade. And of course, Scott Joplin, growing up in the South, would have been familiar with these traditions. And so he's really doing a cool thing here by sort of incorporating the idea of classical music with the piano, sort of the American style marching band marches from Sousa, and also African influences like heavy percussive, highly syncopated rhythms, and also that kind of quick syncopated strumming of the banjo all into one piece. So turning to the concept of melody, I want to take a look at the contour here, especially thinking of banjo music in our minds right now. Remember that contour is one quality of a melody, one way to analyze melody, and that has to do with the overall shape of it. So you think of like contour of a landscape, for example, it's sort of the rolling hills or the jagged mountains, that would be the contour. So same thing here, you can actually drag your finger or pencil or computer cursor, whatever, and almost play like connect the dots through the note heads here. And that gives you the sense of the contour. So the line is drawn right here. I took this image from the textbook, chapter 49. And there are many ways that you could describe this contour, but it kind of does look like a mountain range. It's very jagged, very up and down, kind of zigzag-like. It's certainly not a smooth, gentle contour. So that's kind of the sound that you would expect out of a banjo as well. We can also look at the melodic contour of the left hand, or the bass line, and this is actually a great example of what's called stride bass. So if you were to do the same thing in terms of contour and trace the note heads, you'd see this makes even more of a jagged, mountain-like zigzag contour. So the left hand would have to be moving very quickly between low notes, high notes, low notes, high notes. So the left hand is literally striding back and forth across the keyboard. So that's where we get this term from. So it's really quite a striking technique, and I'm going to play you a quick example here of what stride piano actually looks like. So this is Joe Turner playing Carolina Shout, and pay attention to his left hand and how quickly back and forth it strides across the keyboard. So this is sort of the same concept, and Joe Turner is certainly influenced by ragtime styles of music. The left hand is keeping a steady beat using that stride bass up and down, and the right hand is playing a really complicated, highly decorated, syncopated melody above that. All right. So those are two important aspects to consider when you're listening and analyzing this piece, but I want to make one final sort of interesting historical context note, and that has to do with music technology. So we're just entering the 20th century by the time Joplin publishes this piece, the Maple Leaf Rag, and he was known for recording some of his ragtime pieces on player piano rolls. So you may have seen player pianos. They're obviously quite old-fashioned today, but you might see them in like Western dramas. If you've ever watched the TV show Westworld, for example, you see them in all the saloons. Sometimes they're in malls, especially during Christmas time. But this is essentially a self-playing piano, so it looks very much like a normal piano, except right here you can see this sort of empty box, and there's a roll of paper with holes punched in it that would be spinning around, reading the music, and the piano would actually play itself. You can see the keys depressing. I'll show you a video of this. Also known as a pneumatic piano. The pneum, P-N-E-U-M, that root means like air or to breathe. So if you think of like pneumonia, you have a respiratory infection. And so this actually works with a pneumatic device that pumps bellows of air through it to depress each of the keys. Let's see, find the video here. So I'll play you a clip of this video here next, and this is actually a recording made by Scott Joplin himself before like sound recording, before he was able to record his actual performance through sound and audio recording. He was able to actually punch the holes as he played the piano himself into one of these rolls of paper, and that could be fed into a player piano. So now we can recreate that performance over and over again. So here is how somebody from the year 1899, the year this was published, might have heard this piece on a player piano. And here as the camera pans up, we can see the pneumatic bellows right here and the paper that the holes for each note are punched through. Okay, so I'll pause that there. So all of the videos that I showed you today, just short clips of them, can be found in our music appreciation playlist that I've been compiling over the course of the semester. So any video that I play for you in these videos that I'm making can also be found in this playlist if you ever want to go back and review them, or you found something interesting and you'd like to see it again. All right, so that covers chapter 49, and from here on out we'll be exploring a lot of more diverse genres, including the blues and musical theater, and then get into pop music as well. So Scott Joplin really opens up a lot of doors in terms of diversifying music genres from here on out in the US. Thank you for watching.